Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final webinar of the 2025 Spring Hydrologic Outlook webinar series for the Greater Mississippi River Basin. I'm Rose Friedman, one of the hydrologists here at the National Water Center, and I will begin by providing a general overview of the Greater Mississippi River Basin. Following that, we'll hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers who will share more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent to all attendees. The email will include key message information, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of the content covered in this webinar, and a recording of the session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box found there on the bottom right of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So getting started, the key message for today is that the spring flooding potential across the Ohio River Basin is normal to slightly above normal, while the remainder of the Greater Mississippi River Basin continues to have a normal to below normal flood risk. Also, flood risk due to snowmelt is below normal for the upper Mississippi Basin due to a historic lack of snowpack this season. Now we'll go through some of the current conditions and forecast information and discuss how things have or haven't changed over these last 2 weeks and how that plays into the spring flood outlook. Taking a quick look at 14-day precipitation amounts, and really, there's been a considerable lack of rainfall over the Mississippi Basin for the past 2 weeks, with most areas seeing totals of 2 inches or less, but there are some isolated areas that did receive a little bit more, up to 4 inches, which is the lightest orange color here on the map. And looking at the 14-day departure from normal precipitation, we can see that despite the lack of rainfall I just mentioned, precipitation amounts for this time frame remain near normal, with 3-inch plus or minus departures seen across the basin. Next is the current snow water equivalent, which I'll refer to as SWE for the basin. And what we see here is the SWE from 2 weeks ago, and then the current SWE values shown here. And I'll do it one more time, 2 weeks ago to today. And over the past 2 weeks, we continue to see a noticeable reduction in SWE across the upper portions of the basin, which is due to warmer temperatures. However, we do still see some areas with higher SWE values, particularly in northern Minnesota, as well as the upper peninsula of Michigan, which are these pink areas here. And this is due to still frozen soils preventing infiltration. Now we'll look at how that combination of rainfall and snowmelt has impacted the current soil moisture conditions. And shown here is the Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles from 2 weeks ago. And then the current conditions shown here. And the main thing here is, based on this comparison, the overall lack of substantial rainfall and snowmelt has contributed to some of the soil moisture deficits that we're seeing across the basin. Some places, like here in the plains and here in the upper Ohio Valley, where moisture deficits were already in place, we can see that those deficits have become worse. And I'm going to go ahead and swipe again so you can kind of tell that difference. So yeah, while there has been some snowmelt, like I just showed in the previous slide, it just hasn't been significant enough to help some of these areas recover. But here in the Red River of the North Basin, right here, we do see the opposite with soil moisture that was previously wetter than normal. And again, let me swipe so you can kind of see that. Returning to normal conditions. Lastly, I did want to point out that soils across the lower Ohio Basin here do remain wetter than normal, but not quite as much as we saw last time. Moving on to stream flows across the Mississippi Basin, here we are looking at the U.S. Geological Survey's 14-day average stream flow from 2 weeks ago, and then the current conditions seen here. And what really sticks out here is the decrease in stream flow percentiles across the lower Ohio and Tennessee Basins valleys, where 2 weeks ago, let me swipe again, stream flows were between the 76th and 90th percentile, shown here in the blue, the darker blue, due to that major rainfall event we talked about last time, and then now are closer to or below normal. Moving north, we continue to see some elevated flows in parts of the upper Missouri here and the Red River of the North here, basins, due to recent and ongoing snowmelt. And finally, throughout the Mississippi Valley, from pretty much Minnesota all the way down to Louisiana, we see that stream flows have returned mostly to normal compared to 2 weeks ago, where conditions were a little bit more variable. Now taking a quick look at the longer term drought conditions, the U.S. Drought Monitor continues to indicate drought conditions across upper portions of the basin, with severe to extreme drought still impacting portions of the northern and central plains. And these conditions really haven't changed much over the past month since we started these outlooks. The next few slides will focus on the forecast over the next couple weeks and months. And starting with the 7-day precipitation forecast, rainfall is expected across much of the basin over the next week, with the heaviest totals of about 2 to 3 inches forecast over the lower Ohio and Tennessee valleys. And although widespread flooding is unlikely from this event, there could still be some isolated flooding in a few areas, which you'll hear more about in a few minutes. Now looking at week 2, the Climate Prediction Center's 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook shows that probabilities are leaning towards near to above normal precipitation over the Mississippi Basin. And for that same time period, the temperature outlook probabilities are leaning towards above normal temperatures across the basin. Looking further down the road, this is the seasonal precipitation outlook for March, April, and May that I showed during the last outlook. And here is the outlook for April, May, and June. I wanted to show both since the updated outlook doesn't come out until next week. We can see that for both, the probabilities are leaning towards above normal precipitation over the Ohio and middle Mississippi basins, but the signal isn't very strong for either, staying below 50%. And similarly, the seasonal temperature outlook for March, April, and May, and for April, May, and June, with both showing that probabilities are leaning towards above normal temperatures across the southern US. Shifting gears, now we'll look at the 6-month forecast for the Great Lakes as provided by the US Army Corps of Engineers. And to start, Great Lakes ice cover has been below the historical average this season, which has allowed for increased evaporation over the lakes during the winter months. As a result, all lakes are currently below their long-term March averages. As for the forecast, water levels on Lake Superior, Michigan Huron, and Ontario are forecast to remain below average through the spring and summer, although Lake Ontario may experience some fluctuations over the next month due to ice formation in the St. Lawrence River. On the other hand, Lake Erie levels, which are currently near average, will transition to slightly below average as the summer months approach. And lastly, I wanted to mention that Lake St. Clair recently dropped below its long-term average for the first time in nearly a decade, and this was due to ice in the St. Clair River restricting flow. However, water levels on the lake have recovered since then, but are forecast to remain below average through the spring and summer. Now, to show how all of these conditions we just covered impact the flood forecast across the greater Mississippi Basin this spring, we could take a look at the long-range flood outlook, and what we see here on this map is the 50% probability of reaching or exceeding minor, moderate, major flood stages. Based on this outlook, the southern half of the Mississippi Basin faces widespread minor flooding potential, with some areas at risk for moderate flooding, particularly here in the lower Missouri Basin. Additionally, it looks like we could see some minor flooding on the Red River of the North, seen here. And now I'll pass it to Ryan at the Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
So, Rose, next slide, please. All right, so here we're going to start with our 50% flood probability. And this generally, when we look at this graph, is what we expect to see over our next couple months in the Ohio Valley. That's what we deem generally our flood season, or the remainder of our flood season. So moving through March and into much of April, we see generally some trends here, just a lot of minor flood potential across much of the basin. And as we really take a closer look at this, we kind of see two general areas of emphasis, one being the western portions of the Ohio Valley, including the Whites and the Wabash River basins, and also the southern portions of the Ohio Valley, that being the Green and Kentucky River basins as well. And these are going to be probably the areas that we focus on moving forward. And looking at this and at some of the other data, we see that the flood risk is generally normal to maybe slightly above normal as we move through the remainder of our flood season. So let's go to the next slide, Rose. All right, and then we take a look here, and this would be our 25% flood probability, or what we deem kind of that possible category. Before we saw the expected, this would be the possible. And as we look at the graph here, we can see, much more color with this graphic. We see widespread minor to moderate flooding as kind of the general consensus, but we also see some isolated areas of major flooding possible as well. We kind of noticed in the graphic earlier that Rose showed, we saw kind of that lull in the stream flows across some of the Ohio Valley. But as we move forward, we do expect to see some of those renewed rises as we kind of get later into our flood season and start to see the pattern activity kick up once again. I do think it is important, though, to identify that we do have a flood season in the Ohio Valley, and flooding is relatively normal, that being minor flooding across much of our area. So, as we move through spring, we do expect to continue to see flooding across much of the basin. And in this image, we can see once again kind of that western and southern portion of the Ohio Valley being that area that shows more of that clustering per se. But if we look at the larger image itself, we do see, scattered areas of minor flooding here and there. And that's just the way our precipitation patterns work across the region as we get into kind of that convective season is, anywhere is really on the table to pop up and see some minor flooding. So let's go to that final slide, Rose, and we'll take a look at kind of what we're looking at here in the short term. And this would be the what we just pulled this morning, our 10-day river potential level. And I mean, Rose talked about it a little bit with the precipitation graphic there, the forecast that came from our national center. But we are expecting activity once again to ramp up across the Ohio Valley. We already started with some elevated conditions across the southern basin and the Green in Kentucky, as our partners at the Army Corps are still working to get rid of some water from the February flooding. We're going to see a renewed rise. We see in the graphic there the chances for action, stage rises, minor flood, and even some scattered moderate flood conditions across, once again, generally the southern and western portions of the Ohio Valley. But as this system moves through with the intensity of precipitation, we do expect even across much of the basin to see some rises through portions of the area. So to sum it up, we do just, we're seeing that average to even slightly above normal flood conditions. And in the short term, we are going to deal with this potential flood event as we move through this weekend. So with that, I'm going to pass to Jonathan Thornburg at the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Jonathan Thornburg. I'm with the North Central River Forecast Center. So I'll be covering the upper Mississippi River Valley from the headwaters down to just south of St. Louis, Chester, Illinois, to be specific. And I'll also be covering the Hudson Bay drainage, which includes the Red River of the North and the Souris River and some of the Great Lakes portions of the drainage. So moving on to the next slide, please, Rose. Overall, the flood risk for the NCRFC area, and pretty much from north of central Iowa and central Illinois north, is below normal for this outlook, and south of that portion from central Iowa south and the southern part of our service area is near normal. To put this below normal flooding potential into perspective, for our 50% probabilities, we're only really seeing some potential for minor flooding along the Red River main stem of the north, and then a handful of other National Weather Service forecast points that are typically prone to flooding for this time of year anyways. And then again, that southern portion of our service area, as you can see there. And really only one of our 460 National Weather Service forecast points is showing a 50% chance greater of moderate flooding, which is the red dot there. And we have no points that are showing a chance of major flooding in those 50% probabilities. If you go to the next slide, please, Rose. So it's a high-level overview of the navigation system for the Mississippi River and the Illinois River. Many of you have seen these graphics, but I'll take a moment just to explain them for those who haven't. So these are the graphics that are tied to those long-range outlooks. So as you're looking at this graphic, there's two ways you can look at this graphic. You have the blue line, which is what we historically expect to happen, and then we have the black line, which is the conditional simulations. And so the one way to look at this is if the black line is above the blue line, we're in wetter than normal conditions. Whereas if the black line is below the blue line and to the right of it, then we're in drier normal conditions. The other way to look at it is if we look at that middle graphic there with the Mississippi River at Rock Island, we can see that at any given year with these for this given time for the next 3 months, we would expect about 50% of the time to exceed moderate flood levels based on that blue arrow that we draw down to the exceedance probabilities. But this year, with our conditions as they are, we're only looking at a 12% at this particular location of exceeding moderate flood levels. So across the board, we're looking at it very good right now for the Mississippi River main stem, almost for the whole entire main stem from St. Paul all the way down to St. Louis for about 15 to 30% below normal chance of exceeding moderate flood levels. We did have some rainfall last week across the Illinois River Basin, which elevated things. So that made the Illinois River bump up a little bit, but we're still about 10% below normal chance of exceeding moderate flood levels on the Illinois River. Next slide, please. The one thing that's been a different this year is because we've had such little snowfall, there hasn't been much snow to insulate the ground. So we've developed favorable, really deep frost depths across our area. To put that in perspective, usually Minnesota about this time of year has about 12 to 25 inches by mid-March, and we're still carrying at least 20 in most places. And so deep frost is a concern. It can be a key ingredient for significant spring flooding due to the increased surface runoff. So until we get some thaw in that upper layer of that heavy frost layer, we'll be vulnerable to heavy rainfall scenarios. And that potential driver in flooding isn't necessarily captured by these exceedance probabilities. Frost depths have decreased slightly since the last outlook. We should continue to see those depths diminish as we are now entering that winter to spring transition. We have started to see some thaw towards the top, pretty much from the Minneapolis Twin Cities south. We've started to see 3 to 6 inches at least on that top layer, creating some room for any future rainfall events. But as we go north, that falls off quickly. And for example, across the Red River Valley, we have not had any thaw in that deep frost layer at all yet. So that is something that we are watching, especially as we go into this weekend. We know that there's a very dynamic system that's coming over the Red River Valley this weekend. And there's a significant amount of uncertainty with that system, particularly over the Red River Valley. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the amount of liquid that's going to be in that, and also the precipitation typing. Some of it's going to fall as rain, some of it's going to fall as snow. And then we have cold temperatures that are immediately following that. So it all depends. We have 2 really warm days here coming that we're hoping to gain some thaw in that frost layer to make some room for that rainfall. But at the moment, we're kind of expecting some bankful type rises up in the Red River Valley, but I wouldn't rule out some potential for some minor flooding, depending on how that rain falls on that frost. So lastly, I'll just say that once again, because there has been such a lack of snow cover, the surface water bodies have been allowed to accumulate a lot more ice this year. So as we transition out of winter into spring, those ice on those rivers and those lakes are going to start breaking up, and that's going to elevate some risk for some ice jams across our area. So that's about all I have. I'm going to pass it off to Ben over at MBRFC.
Hey, thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Sproul. I'm a hydrologist here for the Missouri River Basin Forecast Center. And basically, we'll be covering from the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the mouth where the Missouri comes to an end in St. Louis. So, all right, before we get started here, I'd like to start by noting that the flood risk for the Missouri River Basin is below normal for the spring. Now, the one key factor contributing to this reduced flood risk, which I'm about to go over, is deterioration of soil moisture conditions across the basin since last June. As Rose showed in her overview earlier, we've had some pretty low soil percentiles that have shown that the soils are pretty dry across the majority of the basin. Rose also showed the drought monitor, which as of today, 62%, that's 62% of the basin is classified in some level of drought. So for all practical purposes, going back in time, we're now entering the 5th consecutive year of drought for the Missouri River Basin. Next slide, please, Rose. All right, so a lot of my other counterparts have already kind of showed this already, about 50% probability maps with the long-range outlooks for the next 3 months. Hopefully this graphic conveys the impact of the dry conditions, which before you highlights minor to moderate flooding expected this spring, mainly in the lower basin. Flooding in this region is typical as it's primarily driven by thunderstorm activity. In fact, we've had already experienced some flooding in this region over the past couple of months that have kept soils moist. So it's no surprise to see expected spring flooding in the lower basin being outlooked. Next slide, please, Rose. Okay, so don't let this graphic overwhelm you. I'm going to take you through this step by step. This graphic highlights river locations with below normal flood risk. These areas, which are shown in cooler colors, just represent streams and locations where the probability of flooding is lower than the historical chance of flooding. So for areas not highlighted on this map, which have a near normal risk of flooding, which in other words, locations that typically experience springtime flooding are likely to flood again this year and vice versa. Whereas warmer colors, where there's a few isolated spots on this map, what that represents is streams and locations where our probability of flooding is higher than the historic chance of flooding. Jonathan showed some of those graphics earlier in his slides with North Central, showing that difference that exists between the conditional run of flooding versus the historical. So this is just showing you that difference and giving you the overall picture here that, again, emphasizing there's a lower risk for flooding across the basin. But however, a reduced flood risk does not necessarily mean flooding will not occur, and nor does an increased flood risk guarantee that flooding will happen. The importance of all this is that this map alone does not indicate specific locations expecting flooding. Rather, that was shown on the previous slide where we showed the 3-month outlook for river flooding, where the greatest risk is in the lower basin. Okay, next slide, please, Rose. All right, now on to snowpack and water supply. The left-hand graphic, which is courtesy of the National Resources Conservation Service, shows that the current snow water equivalent by subbasin for the mountainous regions, and that area, as of now, the mountain snowpack is near average for this time of year. Typically, by this point of the season, we've accumulated probably approximately 80% of the seasonal peak in snow water equivalent. Speaking of, the right-hand graphic displays the water supply forecasts with regards to that snow water equivalent produced by the National Weather Service, showing that the April to September volumetric runoff projections. And the colors here indicate that most locations are expected to receive 50 to 75% of their normal mountain runoff this year. But despite the lower than normal mountain runoff, it's worth mentioning a few details concerning flood risk in the upper and middle portions of the Missouri River Basin. First of all, any and widespread shallow plain snowpack throughout the winter has melted and is not expected to significantly enhance spring flood risk in the Missouri Basin. However, very cold temperatures during the winter, combined with a lack of insulating snowpack, has led to deep frost penetration, particularly in the Dakotas. So recall what Jonathan just showed in the North Central and what he said with regards to that, showing that deep frost penetration, which is still lingering right now, especially in his area of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and for us across the Dakotas. With that significant depth that's present, if there's any soil moisture, especially when the ground froze as we start to thaw out, that could exacerbate spring runoff for the region, especially with any future precipitation. So this remains a big wildcard factor for those northern soils across the Missouri River Basin, as well as the possibility of any future flooding. And secondly, as always, kind of the big caveat here with the return of spring and wherever river ice is present, warmer temperatures could easily exacerbate the risk of ice jam formation and the breakup leading to potential flooding. We already saw that a couple of times earlier this season, notably in the main stem Missouri, January and February. And then again, we actually had that big warm up across Montana, and we saw some ice jamming in the Yellowstone. So it's possible, winter's not over yet. We can definitely see that again. So in summary, spring flood risk in the Missouri River Basin is below normal. And over the next 3 months, minor to moderate flooding is expected in the lower basin. And lastly, again, referencing the image on the right here, mountainous snow melt runoff contributions to water supply out west are expected to be 50 to 75% of normal. So that concludes my portion here. I'll now hand it over to Becky Harjo at the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Benjamin. Hi, this is Becky Harjo with ABRFC, and the percentage chance for spring flooding went up just slightly at most locations across ABRFC since the last webinar 2 weeks ago. However, these percentages are still a little lower compared to what they were 4 weeks ago, because our climatological risk of river flooding is being driven by convective rain events. The long-range river flooding risk in ABRFC's area is still normal. As you can see on this graphic, this spring we're expecting a 50% chance for some minor flooding on the Poto River Basin in Oklahoma, and at the Neosho and Little River basins, also in Oklahoma. The reservoirs in the Arkansas River Basin system have about 91% of their total flood control storage capacity available, and the Red River Basin currently has about 98% of its flood control storage capacity available. So both basins are in great shape to hold any runoff from spring rains. Now I'll turn it over to Matt Wilson with the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
Hey, thanks, Becky. I'm Matt Wilson from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center here in Slidell, Louisiana. Next slide. Here in the Lower Mississippi Basin, flooding on the main stem is primarily driven by inputs from the upstream basins. We are expecting those inputs to be average to below average at this time. Flooding in the rest of the basin is due primarily to heavy rainfall, and so we are currently expecting the overall flood risk for the Lower Mississippi Basin to be below average. Since the second outlook, the vast majority of our service area has received less than 75% of expected rainfall. Due to these drier than normal conditions, the majority of locations have lower chances for flooding in this outlook than the previous two. The main exceptions to this are a few areas with heavy rainfall forecasted within the next few days. Next slide. Currently, we only have 14 locations above the action stage, but almost all of those locations are past crest and receding. With that said, we have a few basins of concern for flooding. First, the Pearl and the Gulf Coast basins east of the Mississippi. Large swaths of this area have received above average rain since December 1st. Second, the Calcasieu drainage in southwest Louisiana and the drainages on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in eastern Louisiana. Lastly, the section of the Mississippi River immediately above and below Cairo, Illinois, as well as the lower section of the Ohio. As always, flooding is a common occurrence in our service area in the springtime, and that trend will continue this year. Now, back to Rose in Tuscaloosa.
Thanks, Matt. We'll wrap up this presentation with one more look at our key messages for this year's spring flood outlook, which are the potential for spring flooding across most of the Ohio River Basin is normal to slightly above normal, while the remainder of the greater Mississippi River Basin has a normal to below normal flood risk. Additionally, flood risk due to snowmelt across the upper portions of the basin is below normal. If you have any questions for any of today's presenters and you haven't already utilized that question box, feel free to do that now and we'll take a few minutes to answer them. Okay, I don't see any questions. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And just a final reminder that a follow-up email will be sent with the key messages, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of the information we just covered, and the recording of this webinar. Please reach out to your River Forecast Center or us here at the National Water Center if you have other questions or need any other information. Thanks again and have a great weekend.